Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I'm joining from Addis-Ababa, where the Africa Climate Summit will happen from next week. And thank you for allowing me to share the highlights of the report with our dear listeners.
All right, let's talk about
Um,
those highlights then. What are the key findings of the Climate Finance Shadow Report for the IGAD Regional Economic Community by Oxfam and IGAD?
all right, so one of the major highlights, and indeed the major highlight, is that rich polluting nations continue to break their obligation, continue not to meet their obligations to provide climate finance to these countries. Remember, this is an obligation that they are mandated to provide for in accordance with international agreements that they've signed up to. Our report shows that between 2013 and 2022, the amount provided when measured against the needs of this country only accounts to 4%. So there's a gap of 96% of the needs that are not being met. In other words, what's emerging is that rich countries are failing in their obligation to meet the climate finance needs that they have signed up to. And it's our duty to hold them to account for those obligations. Beyond the findings that show this stark and almost scandalous obligation of responsibility, we are concerned that there's also mislabeling of loans as climate finance. Our report shows that 46% of the funds provided were actually in form of loans for this region. And this is problematic because this region is one of those areas that is worst hit by the climate crisis. Millions of people are struggling with living under climate-induced conditions. In fact, as of last year, 63.3 million people were facing acute food shortage in that region. And yet, nations that are responsible, that have signed up to provide the climate finance, are abdicating in this responsibility. So this is important as we congregate in Addis Ababa to talk about climate change and what it portends for the continent.
So the report was released ahead of the summit that we talk of, the second African Climate Summit in Ethiopia. What will you be calling for there?
Indeed, the Africa Climate Summit is an important space. We have about 45 heads of state and government expected here, as well as over 25,000 delegates. So it's an important space. We will be calling for homegrown solutions for Africa to also contribute to developing, profiling, putting forward solutions to the climate crisis. But beyond that, in this conversation, we must call out rich polluting nations who should be providing climate finance in form of grants and not loans. So we are calling for expanding grants provision and not loans. Our report, for example, point out that some of those fragile contexts, take the case of Eritrea and Somalia, they only receive 1 and 2% of their needs, their documented needs as climate finance. I mean, that's unacceptable. They're struggling with the insecurity and the crisis in those regions, but at the same time, nations that continue to pollute our environment, continue to make Africa suffer these disproportionate consequences, are abdicating that responsibility of providing climate finance. So we want this to be part of the conversation. We want the unjust climate finance to be featured. Africa is for ambitious action, but that action without finance will be meaningless. Whereas there are solutions that African heads of state want to showcase. For example, if you look at the continent, we have 60% of the energy, solar energy potential. And yet what has been tapped in terms of solar PV is only 1%. that also extends to other sectors. For example, we look at agroecology, their leadership we can provide there, indigenous land management, etc. So in that conversation, we must also call for global partnership, where rich and polluting nations put the money on the table to help us address this climate crisis, which is not of our making. Remember, for example, the 8 IGAD regions we talked about in the report. Their contribution in terms of greenhouse gas emission is 0.09%. That's negligible. And yet, they disproportionately carry this burden. What do they need? They need climate finance, and not in form of loans. They need it in form of grants to help them adapt, to help them mitigate, and to rebuild their lives when disasters strike. That is what we are calling for. But beyond that also, we are encouraging African leaders to ensure that even when finance is available, that finance should be accessible to local communities, what we call frontline communities. In many instances, the mechanism for accessing this finance is beyond the reach of majority of people. And so it is also a moment for Africans also to introspect. So not only talking about outward facing, calling for solutions, but also looking inwardly into homebred solutions that can also elevate Africa's position in the conversation, in the table where we're talking about joint solutions for the climate crisis.
Finally, and just briefly, what else are you going to be looking forward to in this conference in Ethiopia?
Thank you. So for us, what we are hoping to see is that there'll be the African heads of state, because this is the second Africa Climate Summit. The first one happened in Nairobi in 2023. The African heads of state and governments and delegates, we will come up with a firm commitment, a firm position that puts Africa's solution forward. So that is one thing we're calling for. We are challenging Africans to look for how they can maximize what we have, our God-given resources, to help ourselves be part of the solution to the climate crisis. We are also calling for solidarity. African voice matters in this conversation. And yet, we face a number of barriers, political, unequal access to resources to deal with the crisis, and just disjointed approaches to the climate solution. So if we can build on that solidarity, then that momentum, that pressure can help in the international diplomacy around climate change negotiation.
David, thanks
we are
again.
hoping, for example, that
Yes.
For example, finally, that climate finance will be made a priority, and it will be made accessible to the people who need it the most.
All right,
Thank
David,
you so
thank you so much again for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's David Abudho.